Thank you, Madam Speaker. And it's indeed a pleasure to be able to rise today. And I want to thank my colleague from Parry Sound Muskoka, our Chief Critic for Foreign Affairs or Global Affairs, on bringing forward this motion today, because this is important. I'm disappointed that the government never brought forward this motion. You know, we established as government when we were in power the principled position that all military deployments, that all changes in missions should be debated in this place. It is important to engage every member of Parliament in making the decisions on how we use the Canadian Armed Forces in fighting terrorism, in deploying our troops, going against oppressors, and making sure that we stop mass atrocities. It is disappointing that there's going to be changes made to this mission. And we still aren't sure why the Liberals made this promise in the first place during the last election campaign. We still have not heard from the Prime Minister, from the Minister of Global Affairs, from the National Defence Minister on why it makes sense to withdraw our planes from the fight against ISIS. You know, later today, leaders from all parties, I believe, are going to be going to Toronto to welcome the first plane load of Syrian refugees. And all these refugees are fleeing ISIS. If we want to stop the humanitarian crisis, if we want to stop the genocide that ISIS is carrying out, we have to actually defeat ISIS itself. And you don't do that by taking the back seat. We've got to remember that ISIS has declared war on Canada. And as the member from Parry Sound Muskoka was saying earlier, we were talking about the atrocities and the terrorist acts and the murders that were committed in San Bernardino, in Paris, in Beirut, in Egypt. But let's not forget that ISIS inspired the attacks that took the lives of Warrant Officer Patrice Vincent and Corporal Nathan Cirillo. ISIS has declared war on Canada. And it is paramount that the government defend and protect our nation and our citizens. Now, the United Nations gets this. And the Security Council determined on November 20th that the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or Sham, ISIL, or ISIS, or Daesh, however you want to call them, they said they constituted an unprecedented threat to international peace and security, calling upon member states with the requisite capacity to take all necessary measures to prevent and suppress its terrorist acts on territory under its control in Syria and Iraq. The Council urged member states to intensify their effort to stem the flow of foreign terrorist fighters into Iraq and Syria, and to prevent and suppress the financing of terrorism. Now, as our foreign affairs critic said, this is a three-legged stool. And so we have the humanitarian crisis. We have to deliver humanitarian aid in a major way, and refugees is part of that. We have to stop the ability of ISIS to fund themselves and finance their war and their terrorism. And ultimately, it comes down to stopping ISIS in its tracks. And the only way you can do that, Madam Speaker, is military intervention. And Canada has a long, proud history of taking on those that commit mass atrocities. Think of Passchendaele, Canadians cutting their way through on Vimy Ridge. We talk about how they fought the Nazis and led the attack on D-Day on Juno Beach. We talk about how they stood up against the genocide in Bosnia in the Medak pocket. And we talk about how they took the fight to the Taliban in Afghanistan in places like the Panjwai. We've always distinguished ourselves. We have tremendous, now I always say the best Canadians are members of the Canadian Armed Forces. And in every discipline that they have, whether it's in the Canadian Army, whether it's in the Royal Canadian Navy, or the Royal Canadian Air Force. Each and every member is always up to the fight and up to the task that Parliament sometimes has to put upon them. So we want to make sure that we are doing what's right. And in the absence of a motion coming from the government to define what their plan is, the Conservative Party brought forward our motion today so that Parliament has a chance to pronounce itself on the battle against ISIS. Now, more importantly, I'm concerned that if we didn't have this motion today, that we would hear the change in the new plan, withdrawing our CF-18s, maybe taking out the entire Air Task Force, bringing back our Polaris refuelers, our Aurora reconnaissance aircraft, the 600 members of the Royal Canadian Air Force and others who are right now stationed as part of the Air Task Force in Kuwait, bringing all of them home without actually doing anything to increase our military training that we're doing with the Kurdish Peshmerga. And that those decisions will be made and announced when Parliament isn't sitting over the Christmas break, when hopefully Canadians are busy doing other things and not paying attention to what's actually taking place on the international scene. So it becomes even more important that we have this debate today. Now, we have yet to hear of one of our coalition partners say, yeah, it's great that Canada is taking a step back. I can tell you that the only people that are actually seem to be excited about withdrawing our CF-18s are the Liberals and ISIS. And that is downright embarrassing and dangerous. We have to continue to step up. The Canadian way is always to go in and punch above our weight. And I expect that from this government, especially in light of the recent attacks, especially in light of how the coalition partners have really coalesced around a more robust military intervention, bombing ISIS positions on a more frequent and upscaled basis. And Canada should be doing the same. As bare minimum, we should be leaving the CF-18s in the fight. Yes, we can do more on training. If the government wants to come forward with a proposal on putting more planners, more special operation forces in the field to work alongside the Kurdish Peshmerga and Iraqi security forces, they would have our full support. We believe that ultimately it is boots on the ground that will win this fight. It's going to have to be those who are most at risk are the ones who are going to have to take that fight there. And if you look at the record that we've been able to achieve under the Special Operation Force training with the Kurdish Peshmerga, by far, it is the most successful in the region. And why is that? Not only are we giving them the tools and the skills that's required in training, but we are also a part of the command structure. It's an aid, it's an assist, it's in training. And they do require to go to the front lines along to observe how the Kurdish Peshmerga forces are performing. There's definitely more danger involved in that, but it has been by far more successful. There was a Mr. Hillier that actually went, who was a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, who went and actually fought with the Kurdish Peshmerga. And he came back and he said that our training has been very successful. He also said that the CF-18 bombing strikes have been even more successful. And when we heard from the Kurdistan regional government, they said if it was up to them, they would ask Canada to keep the CF-18s in the fight because they have saved lives and they have destroyed the enemy. Now, we as Parliament really do need to look at how we can best contribute. And that's what we keep hearing from the Prime Minister and from the Minister of Global Affairs, is that they think that the only way we contribute is through the training mission. But this has to be a whole government approach, and it has to involve all aspects of our military assets. We've already expenditured the establishment of the Air Task Force. We've already set up camp, we've already deployed troops, we already have equipment and materiel in theater. It is more important now that we leave those assets there and maximize their use in the fight. As my friend from Wellington Halton Hills pointed out earlier, if it's okay in the first week of December to continue to send our CF-18s out, flying their sorties, collecting intelligence, and making the ultimate decision on whether or not they drop bombs on ISIS targets, if it's good enough now, why won't it be good enough next week, or in January, or all of next year? We should stay involved until we actually defeat ISIS. That is what we're hearing from world leaders. That's what we're hearing from the United Nations. And, you know, it's important that Canada stays engaged. If we want to be a serious player on a global scale, our allies expect us to do our share. Stepping back away from...
Your time is up. I'm sorry. I was so involved in your discussion that I forgot to tell you the time was up. I'm sure that the member will have time to continue his speech in the answers and questions, or the questions and comments. Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Orleans.
Madam Chair, I wonder if the honourable member who made reference to the previous government's efforts in Afghanistan can explain to us why the previous government chose not to deploy CF-18s to Afghanistan and instead focused the overwhelming majority of its efforts on training Indigenous forces, which he's already referred to is producing extraordinary value.
The member from Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
As we all know, Madam Chair, the member from Orleans is a decorated general from the Canadian Army and had a very distinguished career. So as he's suggesting that maybe we don't do the air combat mission, but we actually deploy troops to fight. I don't think that's where the Liberal Party's at. And definitely from our government, when we were government, we decided that training was the best option to aid and assist command and control, was by far the most effective. And that's the approach that we took then. Now, maybe we have to change thoughts, and maybe he's prepared to bring forward those ideas to his leaders in the Liberal Party and suggest to the Prime Minister that we need to have a more robust combat mission by the Canadian Armed Forces through the Special Operations Forces. And if that's what he's suggesting, then you know, I'm sure that the Minister of Defence will be more than happy to take on that advice. But I think what we're talking about here is having a more robust training mission. And I think what we want to see, coming back from the federal government, is that there will be a commitment to keep the CF-18s in the fight, to do our share, and ensure that we defeat ISIS.
Questions and comments. The honourable member from Laurier-Sainte-Marie.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. During my colleague's remarks, I was struck by his comment, in fact, among other things, that all refugees who will be coming are people who are fleeing the armed group ISIS. I wonder if my colleague is aware of the fact that many, if not most of them, are not fleeing ISIS, but the Assad regime. There are many members of the coalition are not participating in the airstrikes. And I'd also like to ask him ultimately why he's so convinced that airstrikes will solve the problem when there are so many examples in the region of conflicts where that didn't lead to a peaceful solution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Speaker.
Interlake Eastman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the member for her question. And there's no question that Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian regime is a genocidal organization themselves. They're the ones that have used chemical weapons against their own civilian population. And there's no doubt that there's a number of other members in the region, like the Free Syrian Army and others, who are creating the stability in the region. So if we're ultimately going to stabilize the area, there is one side of this that is a political debate, one side of this that requires a diplomatic solution. But we know that in dealing with ISIS, that we're dealing with a genocidal, jihadist, terrorist death cult that will stop at nothing. To sit down and talk with them is not an option. And the only thing that they understand is the sword.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member from Central Okanagan, Smith-Amine?
Similkameen, Madam.
Similkameen.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thanks to the honourable member for his presentation today. A constituent actually raised the concern with me. In the throne speech, the Liberal government indicated that it looks to downsize our military. He said that he was concerned that one of the reasons why the Liberals want to withdraw our men and women from this active mission bombing ISIS is because right now that's front and center with the public. By pulling them back, it'll allow them to make larger cuts. Is this member also concerned about that?
A very brief answer from the honourable member from Selkirk, Interlake Eastman.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, or Madam Speaker, and I thank my friend from British Columbia. And, you know, I'm concerned a number of things that were in that throne speech. One that was only 1,700 words long, and not one of those words was ISIS. There's also commitment to a leaner military, which we all know is code words for cuts. And I know that the member from Orleans was speaking earlier. He actually wrote a report on transformation of the Canadian Armed Forces, and it suggested that we actually decrease the size of our reserve force by 50%. And I hope that the Minister of Defence, who was a reservist, will not let that happen.